Hey there, everyone. So, what I'm going to talk about today is giving a bit of in the way of directions and background for the Lichen Lab. So, the focus of this lab is on lichens, especially on reproduction in lichens, looking at sexual and asexual reproduction. Just a reminder that asexual reproduction involves an organism that makes an exact copy of itself, an exact genetic copy of itself, whereas sexual reproduction involves two organisms combining their genes to create an organism that has a combination of their genes but is not genetically identical to either parent. So that's a focus, for example, in Science 9 and something that taking further science courses you want to be remembering. But what maybe is a little bit less familiar is this whole concept of what a lichen is. The strange thing is, in that context, that you see lichens everywhere. They're super common. You just might not know that you're seeing them. So what I'm also going to talk about today is about what lichens are, a little bit of how they grow and where they grow and so forth, and then look at actually the you guys going out and collecting some and examining them. So we're going to look actually more broadly at what is a lichen. I'm going to describe for you the four what are called thallus types of lichens, the different growth forms, and a little bit about what they need to grow. So, what is a lichen? It's actually not one organism. It's actually a partnership of two organisms. In a simplistic way, you could say it's a fungus, it's a mushroom, and a plant. Well, that's not quite accurate. It's more accurate to say that it's a fungus in a partnership, a cooperation with not a large plant, but what's called an alga. Maybe you have that, and that's just a way of saying one algae. Algae are small, microscopic plants that you find all over the place in water and on land. And alga is just one example of an algae. So the full definition is an association of a fungus and a photosynthetic symbiont that results in a stable vegetative body having a specific structure. I underline the word symbiont there because you might not have heard it. Symbiont just means lives in the same place. So specifically what's happening is there's partnership where one of the organisms is making the food and the other is providing the shelter. It's a partnership because both groups benefit. The fungus benefits because the photosynthetic symbiont, alga, makes the food from light and water. That's photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide and water are combined. Light energy provides the energy to make sugars out of that. Those sugars that are made by the alga feed the fungus, and the alga gets shelter in return and other things. I'm going to look at that a little bit later about what the fungus does for the lichen. So this is also called a mutualism, and lichens are actually pretty special critters as well. One thing about them is that they grow all over the place in all kinds of conditions. You can find lichens, in fact, I believe that they're the organisms that live furthest south of anything, a matter of hundreds of kilometers from the South Pole, and they're some of the furthest north living organisms as well. They can survive all kinds of extremes, including being taken into space. They can be taken into space, bombarded by all kinds of radiation, and they don't die. You take them back to land, our atmospheric conditions, and you give them some water and light, and they just kick right back up again and survive. Lichens, being everywhere, are super important in ecosystems. What does that mean? It means that they're important organisms for the other organisms that live in ecosystems. One way that they're important is for what's called succession. So if you ever go high up in the mountains, like really high up, above the snow to where you see glaciers, those huge blocks of ice that are in the mountains here in BC, those glaciers are always melting. And as they melt, they expose bare rock, bare lifeless rock, or just about lifeless at least. that bare rock is eventually going to be colonized by vegetation. In fact, as you're going higher and higher up in the mountains, you'll see like different kinds of plants like heather and some kind of trees. All that stuff that you're walking on when you go for your hike in the mountains used to look exactly like the bare rock does still high in the mountains. What happened was a process of succession where an ecosystem made up of all kinds of vegetation had to develop from nothing. Well, the nothing, what it starts with, under the red arrow there, well, that's lichens. The first organisms that colonize bare rock, like has been left by glaciers after they melt, are generally lichens. They have benefits. One is they help to kind of break up the rock, release some of the nutrients from the rock, but they're also some of the first organisms that are involved in soil being made. And once that organic matter for the soil has been captured, produced, that soil can start to make the next colonizing organisms, which are usually moss. Over time, and by that I mean over centuries, eventually you will get forest, an ecosystem with lots of mature vegetation, but it all started with lichens. A thing about lichens that might actually make this activity a little bit difficult to do is that they are actually quite sensitive to air pollution. I live in Smithers, and most of the time when I'm looking for lichens, I'm looking around Smithers, but this time I happened to be in Vancouver. It was a bit more of a difficult time to find them in the city. But the other side of that is that makes them an excellent way of monitoring, measuring the quality of the air. If the air is super low quality, then that's going to be reflected in whatever lichens can or really cannot grow on the rocks and on the trees. So lichens are classified down to species, not based on the alga, but based on the fungus, right? Just remember, folks, that organisms are classified as species. Species are different kinds of organisms. The whole species concept for lichens is a bit weird because you might think, well, I'm not classifying a single organism. I'm actually classifying a partnership. But in this case here, what you're classifying, you can best describe it as saying that you're actually classifying the fungus that happens to take on a certain alga. So that's how they're grouped, is based on the fungus. That symbiont, that fungus, can't live without the alga. As you can see, lichens get all kinds of crazy colors, which is part of what makes this lab activity and looking at lichens so much fun. This is more of a Biology 11 or a Life Sciences 11 topic. Ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. Most lichens are from ascomycetes, that group of fungi. And as for the alga, well, there's two groupings of alga. One is what are called eukaryotes that have a cell nucleus and all that stuff that you guys will already have heard of. And the other, it's called prokaryotes. In other words, bacteria. Prokaryotes and eukaryotes can both make alga because alga are just tiny little organisms that can photosynthesize. And those alga are both types of organisms that can become in that mutualism with fungi to make lichens. So you can get bacteria or you can get non-bacterial alga to make lichens with the fungus. All right, some concepts and terms that are useful for the lab activities specifically. One is the concept of the thallus. Thallus is it forms most of the body, it forms most of the lichen. It's the bulk of any lichen is its thallus. One thing about lichens is a lot of people sort of group them or think of them as plants. They're not really plants. They really are fungi. And in that way, they don't have stems or leaves or roots or vascular system, or not like you see in most plants. They're different because effectively you're looking at the structure of a fungus. They're often grouped with plants because they do photosynthesize, but otherwise you have to think of them as fungi. There's 4 growth forms I'd like you to become familiar with. The first is the fruticose growth form. Fruticose lichens often look like tiny trees. A point of difference, of course, is that they're not colored like tiny trees. They can be crazy colors of yellow or kind of pale green, but the structure it looks a bit like a tiny tree. Very often these kinds of fruticose lichens will grow on the ground, especially like in mountain forests or in the Arctic. You'll see they cover huge areas of the ground. Also, they often are found growing on tree branches. Another kind that you're probably not going to see in the city is the foliose lichen. Foliose lichens are often, they look like, this one, for example. This one's called Peltigera. Notice that it has no like rooty type structures on the underside of it. It's got a kind of a leaf-like look to it. Foliose means like a leaf. Peltigera is also called frog's pelt, which can maybe kind of make sense, right? It kind of does look like someone skinned a frog. These lichens often have kind of weird and wacky names like this. If you're in the city, you're probably not going to find frog's pelt or Peltigera or really any foliose lichen. These ones are especially sensitive to air pollution. So, if you ever do see a foliose lichen, you know that you're in a place with nice, clean air. Notice that there's upper and lower surfaces that are both exposed to the air in the foliose lichens. A third kind is crustose lichens. These guys, they often look like they're part of the rock. You see that? You can't take you can't say stick a knife under the edge of these things because they grow tight to the rock. They form a crust on the rock. If you look close at them, you'll realize, no, they're not part of the rock. There's something growing on the rock, but they grow very tight on it. Crustose lichens that form a crust on the rock often grow really slowly. What you're seeing there, I think, is called map lichen. Those little colonies of map lichen, those little circles there, are probably decades old. An example of a crustose lichen, say, as big as a dinner plate. I saw one when I was hiking the other day, a huge one. That was probably 500 or 600 years old. These things grow very slowly, which is maybe not too surprising because after all, these crustose lichens are growing without much water and with no nutrients or with virtually no nutrients at all to work with. So they grow under really difficult conditions and they grow really slowly. And again, you've got all kinds of colors. If you ever see like rock that has like lots of like almost spray paint orange color on it and you're way up high in the mountains, you're probably looking at a lichen. Or like this here, we have this very bright yellow-green type color. You know, you're dealing with a crustose lichen right there. The last is kind of in between crustose and foliose. It's called squamulose. There's a big word for you right there. Squamulose lichens are pretty common. You often are going to find squamulose lichens in the city. If there's any growth form you're going to find in the city, squamulose is going to be it. They often grow on trees, and they form these kind of like flaky structures that are partly stuck to the tree. So you can kind of peel up the edge, but they've got these root-like things underneath. So they're not like foliose. They're not like foliose in that way. They're actually somewhat or slightly attached to whatever surface they grow on. Inside the lichen, it's actually made of a number of layers. So you have an outer layer that's kind of like the outer skin that gives protection to the alga. Of course, that's fungi. This layer right below it, is the photosynthetic one. It's still got lots of fungi in there, but the fungi are cradling. They're holding these alga because, after all, the alga are feeding them. Underneath that, you've got this medulla layer, and below that, you have kind of a lower skin, and then some lichens that are attached to surfaces like rock, like wood or bark, have got these things. They don't have proper roots like plants, but things that are called rhizines that are a little bit like roots. Now, grade 9 concept, reproduction. I talked about sexual and asexual reproduction. Lichens can do it both ways. They can reproduce sexually and they can reproduce asexually. So what sexual reproduction uses in the lichens is it uses specialized parts. And here are some concepts that I think it's good for you to learn at the grade 9 level. These are kind of weird and wacky words, but if you're also doing the mushroom lab and mushroom dissection as part of this unit, some of this might be a little familiar to you, a little bit at least. One word, the first concept, new concept for this slide, the apothecium. The apothecium is one example of a kind of structure that will carry reproductive cells or reproductive units. The other possibility is a parathecium. Apothecia are generally kind of like shallow, or they're a little bit like bowls. Not quite like a deep bowl, though, like a shallow bowl. The parathecium does the same thing as an apothecium, but it's deeper. It's kind of like a bowl shape, but a deep bowl shape. What they do is they make these things called ascospores. The ascospores are the result of sexual reproduction between the fungi mutualists, which makes spores that don't actually have the algal cells on them. What happens is those the ascospores, after they germinate and they set down their hyphae, they then make contact with algal cells, and then you can get the ball rolling and make an actual lichen like the parent was. So these are parathecia. Again, your ascospores, those little reproductive units, the things that will be like seeds for the lichen to make a new one, they come out of the parathecia. Apothecia and parathecia look different, do the same thing. As for asexual reproduction, that can work by fragmentation. Again, if you looked at the mushroom dissection lab, I talked a little bit about that. So with fragmentation, you actually got units that are breaking off. Those parts that are breaking off have got both fungus parts to them, and they're carrying a little bit of the algal cells as well. So they're basically like a little piece of the lichen itself. When they break off, they can settle on some other place where the lichen can grow, and a new organism can grow. But of course, because this is asexual reproduction, that offspring organism is genetically identical to the parent. So both Soredia and Isidia, those are structures that are produced in asexual reproduction. So you see Isidia are peg-like, and then Soredia, algal cells wrapped in hyphae. Diaspores, that little spheres of lichen, are inside. So that's Soredia on this slide and Isidia on this side. They do the same thing. I've already kind of talked a bit about the mutualism. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Why do a mutualism? Why engage in a mutualism? Well, we engage in a mutualism. A lichen engages in a mutualism, or any organism does, if you can get something out of it. In the case of the fungus, it's getting an energy source from the alga, the miniature plant. The miniature plant is getting shelter and some nutrients. So most sugars are absorbed into the fungus, and some cyanobacteria are also giving nitrogen, which is an important nutrient. As for the alga, it's a bit less obvious what it gets, but sometimes the fungus provides water, nutrients, and also protects the alga from injury and predators and intense light. So in summary, a lichen is a partnership between an alga or cyanobacteria and a fungus. Lichens are abundant, and they're important in how forests develop, can reproduce sexually and asexually, and there are some important terms I'd like you to learn for when you do the lab. Okay, let's look at the lab now. So the lab activity that goes with this involves you going into nature, like a forest, or even it can be your backyard, if you're lucky at least, finding lichens, bringing them back, doing a drawing of them, trying to find some of these structures on them. There's a number of different ways to spin this, and it partly depends on what equipment you or your teacher might have. So in my methods, the way I describe this, go to the local forest to collect lichens. Choose some specimens to examine and collect. You might want to bring a little Rubbermaid and possibly a knife to collect these. One thing I've done when I do this lab is I like to mark them. Put a little circle with liquid paper on them and use a Sharpie to put a number on it. That just lets you keep track of the specimen numbers if you wanted to do that. Drawing, I think doing drawing is super valuable. It allows you to get a better appreciation of what you're seeing. It basically makes you take close up observations. And that's the way you're going to discover things like, hey, does it have soredia or isidia, so asexual, or does it have apothecia, so for sexual reproduction, and so on. The other things that you can do if you have the equipment are to conduct UV tests and then potassium hydroxide tests. But if you're doing this alone, you're probably not going to have the resources for that. So those are your 4 growth forms again: crustose, squamulose, fruticose, and foliose. And then when I'm doing this, I'm having my students choose 6 specimens and to draw them. What did that look like when I did this? The first thing was being in the city was a bit of a difficult time finding them. But even in the city, if you're in a park, if you go to a park in the city, you're probably going to find some lichens, even though they are sensitive to the air pollution in the city. So we see some lichens right here on the side of this snag right here that are they're doing okay there. And I collected some of them right there. And I brought the lichens back, and along with some I found in my backyard. Equipment you're going to want there, really simple. You're going to want a magnifying glass would be good, not crucial. You want the handout, and you want pencil crayons. When I'm doing this lab, or my students are doing this lab, we're definitely looking for the apothecia, soredia, isidia. In other words, looking for evidence of sexual reproduction. And then when we're doing the lab, we're being like, hey, do I see it? Well, the arrow points to where I think it is. That's a closer up look at these 3 lichens that I found in the backyard and then did some drawings of. So there you go. Some people like to identify the lichens they collect. Lichens are often really hard to identify. There's sometimes when you can actually take a picture of it, like for my mushroom dissection lab, and you can upload that to the internet, and the internet will identify it for you. Sometimes you can do that. There are also specialized books about this. You can get field guides or plant guides that sometimes will have a bunch of lichens at the back, and you can just scroll through and look for the picture of a lichen that matches yours best. That's if your teacher is interested in your identifying lichens. Those are, I guess, some of your options. Or just ask an expert, or maybe your teacher has that knowledge already. However you do this, I hope this has been a good review for you of sexual and asexual reproduction. And maybe there's some learning pieces you've got out of this about what a lichen is. And most importantly, I hope you enjoy yourself going outside, hunting for lichens, and having fun drawing. Happy hunting.